What is, Danny, this line of questioning trying to establish?
It's trying to establish her knowledge of Donald Trump's day-to-day activities, how he was involved, whether he was hands-on, whether he was a micromanager. I expect we're going to hear a lot of questioning about how he conducted his day and the business. And really what we're going to get to shortly is how the process went when she would bring checks for him to sign, specifically the Michael Cohen checks that Yasmin showed us on the screen, and that process and how involved he was. And then when we get to cross, I expect that the defense will have to explore whether or not was he distracted? Did he just sign things without looking at them? I imagine the prosecution will sort of pre-butt that in their questioning and try to paint Donald Trump as somebody who was intensely involved at every step. Madeleine Westerhout, by the way, we've just spent a day and a half on Stormy Daniels, right, whose importance in terms of evidence, in my view, is minimal compared to the flashy nature of her testimony. Now we've got a witness that maybe some people have heard of. She may not be on the stand that long, but her testimony, in my view, is arguably much more critical than the day and a half we just spent on Stormy Daniels.
No doubt. I mean, Rebecca, and just now what they're asking her is, how he spent his time. And Westerhout says he spent most of the time when he was there working, reading, going over documents in the dining room. That was really his working office. Mangold, was there an organizational system there? Westerhout, to my understanding, the president knew where things were and he kept things organized, but he did have a lot of papers. I found that he always knew where things were. What does that tell you right there, Rebecca?
The prosecution is trying to establish that the former president himself was involved in these payments. And so all of this is about connecting him to the documents that he signed, trying to make it clear that he didn't just delegate, that he didn't just sign things without thinking about it or knowing anything, that there was an organization and a system to it.
I mean, here it is specifically what you're referring to. The question is he the type of person who paid attention to details? Westerhout, in my experience, yes. Mangold, signature practices. Did he use an automated signature or sign by himself? Westerhout, he signed by himself. Did he use a particular type of pen? Sharpies or Pentel felt tip? Did he typically read things before signing them? She says, yes. Did Mr. Trump use social media while he was in the White House? Westerhout, he did, yes, primarily Twitter, now called X. Did Mr. Trump post tweets himself using that Twitter handle? Yes, he did. Danny, once again, this is someone with first-hand knowledge of the president's use of his time, down to who and how he used the social media accounts. Clearly, she's saying that he was very on top of that, as he was about every single document.
So earlier we learned in just today that these checks would be FedExed overnight to the White House. Now, if I'm the defense, I'm thinking, okay, we've got an angle here. We can frame this as the president became the president of the United States, the leader of the free world. The guy was busy. This is what the defense is going to try and argue, that when these checks came in, even if he did sign them, he just scribbled them. He wasn't really looking. He wasn't paying attention. That is what the prosecution knows is coming, and that's why they bookended this. We heard the testimony about how the checks got put into the FedEx, how they ended up at the White House, and now we're hearing the other end of that transaction, how Madeleine Westerhout personally takes these checks in, gets them signed, and I expect her testimony is going to be good for the prosecution, or else why else would they have called her? And we're going to hear that Donald Trump, when he signed these checks, we're already hearing it, that he did it personally, that he's involved. Maybe if he had questions, he would raise those questions. Maybe we'll hear that kind of testimony. But this is just locking in how the transactions worked to make it increasingly and increasingly less likely that this is something that flew totally under Trump's radar.
Rebecca, micromanager is the word that comes to mind when one sees what Westerhout is describing as far as Donald Trump's focus on things. Here's just the line of questioning that's going on right now about his process of tweeting from the @RealDonaldTrump account. So here's Westerhout. If Dan Scavino, who was the other person who had access to that account, wasn't available or around, the president would call me in and dictate a tweet to me. And then I would go back to my computer and type it up and print it out and give it back to him so he could go over it. He would dictate it. I would type it up on a computer, print a hard copy, take it back to him for review. Then he edited sometimes the hard copy. He would ask to make additional changes, then show it to him. He liked to use exclamation points. But once again, this is someone who looks at every single word, every single period, every single exclamation point.
You know, I'm curious what the defense does about this, because in a way, this testimony, unlike Stormy Daniels' testimony, kind of makes him look good. You know, in a certain way, he's involved in his work. He's diligent. He's a hard worker. And, you know, so they obviously have to set up on some level that, you know, this was running below his radar, but they have to do it without undermining their client's sense of ego, which is being built up in this testimony, unlike in Stormy Daniels.
Yeah, I mean, someone who, you know, cares how many exclamation points they're putting in on a tweet shows you that maybe your time used and the focus that you used to have on some things over others may be significant.
Yeah, I actually take a slightly different view. I think this testimony doesn't make him look that good because, yes, he has attention to detail, but if you're the leader of the free world, I'd rather you spend your time on the Middle East and not whether or not your tweets are in caps or
how many
exclamation points you have. And the process, by the way, tweeting is normally just I take my phone, I tweet. This apparently was paper, printed out, come here, approve. All the while, Middle East going on. I have no idea how that's being addressed. So I guess I'm stepping out of legal analyst and thinking more like a regular person who might be on the jury or might be thinking, this is really not how the president should have been spending his time, even if it was attention to detail. But it is important context, and I expect the jury is listening closely because, once again, they've called a witness that gives us a glimpse into a world we never otherwise would have had access to. First, it was the world of the National Enquirer. Then it's the world of Stormy Daniels. Now we're hearing about how a president did his day-to-day work, which to me is fascinating no matter what it is, no matter who the president is. Finding that he moved into the dining room to do his business, or that they had to print out tweets to bring to him to approve. I mean, all fascinating, all riveting, and all bad for the defense. You
know, I think it is very difficult later for the defense to claim if you know, this witness is to be, the testimony of this witness is to be given weight, that this is someone who maybe got a check and just signed it, or 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or monthly checks without thinking about it, when he's looking at what parenthesis to use. And I'm just going to go right back to what we're seeing inside that courtroom right now. Did he have any particular preferences to his posts? Yes, certain words he liked to capitalize, including country, capital C. He liked to use dots for a comma. During the first year, Mangold asks, you were there in 2017. Would you describe that as a transition period? Westerhouse, yes. I think the first year of any administration is a transition year, and we did the best work we could for the American people. She continues on to say, we were all trying to learn our way around and do the best work we could for the American people. Did he ever miss things, is the question that Mangold asks. Westerhout, my understanding is he was attentive to things that were brought to his attention. Did you ever have questions for people at the Trump organization? And did they have questions for you? Yes. Mangold, for example, what were some of the major issues at the Trump organization in 2017, and who were the people there? Rona Graff. Again, and Rebecca, this is a time for the defense to be seeing what this person, who clearly is not, I mean, she worked for the president of the United States. She says that, you know, they were trying to do the best they could for the American people. This is not necessarily a person who, you know, like Stormy Daniels, hates Donald Trump. And yet, if you're the defense, what are you looking at here to rebuttal on?
You know, I think the best that the defense can do here is to point out the limit of her knowledge. And actually, as you suggest, her testimony is very detailed and suggests that she has a great deal of knowledge, but nobody knows everything. So the best that they can do is say that she wasn't there. She didn't necessarily know exactly what he was aware of when he signed this particular check. And that, you know, is poking holes in her testimony, even if it isn't undermining the general point that she's